We're launching today our Living Standards Review 2025, and I think at a time when there's lots of discussion about welfare reform, as it's often called euphemistically, and in the run-up to the Chancellor's spring statement on the 26th of March, I don't think this could be any timelier. We've already seen some really good write-ups of what we found in various outlets, so great to see all that interest from our colleagues in the press. And indeed, we've had some coverage already on ITV News thanks to Joel Hills, who's here with us and who's going to be chairing the panel later on. Before, though, we have the panel discussion and before we have the presentation of the report, let me just say a few words of thanks. First of all, to our hosts here at 18 Smith Square, to NIESR's event team and the whole external affairs team led by my colleague Neil, including Margarita and Freya. Thank you so much for helping us put this on. This is a mixed methods project, meaning that we've brought together quantitative with qualitative analysis, about which we'll hear a lot more in a moment. But we couldn't have done that without our wonderful community researchers. And I really want to welcome Lauren, Emma, and Ahmed very warmly here this afternoon. And of course, the NIESR research team, really of both sides of the house, macro and public policy. Too many names to mention, but do please look at the acknowledgements. And also, lots of them are here in the room, and they'll be delighted to talk to you later when we have a reception. Indeed, at 6 o'clock, we'll invite you up on the 7th floor for drinks and some nibbles. So just, that's coming, because between now and then, there's going to be lots to discuss. So I'm going to hand over to Max Mosley in a moment for the summary of the report. But let me just put this into some context very briefly. In May of 2024, in the run-up to the general election, we put out some pre-election briefings on a number of issues, one of which was living standards. And we were quite shocked to find just how much of a hit living standards had taken since 2019, so we're covering essentially the last parliament. And it turns out that the bottom 20% of UK households, that's 5.6 million households in total, were considerably worse off in 2024 than in 2019. So much so that their living standards would not recover before 2026 or 27. Right? That's quite a few years of lower living standards before you even get back to the 2019 level. Never mind, see your living standards improve again, which was the great post-war promise, right? That every generation would have higher living standards than the previous. So that was quite something. And now, in the report, as we'll hear in a moment, that has not just been true for the last 5 years or so. Stagnation and the decline in living standards has been true for a lot longer, really since the financial crisis of 2008, for millions and millions of people. And that, we think, is such a stark finding that we need to understand why and also what we can do about it. You know that NIESR is committed to do things, understanding the economic and social forces that affect people's lives, and then designing better policy to improve people's lives. Well, I think the living standards work brings exactly that together, diagnosis and policy prescription. So I'm really delighted that you can join us here this afternoon. Very much looking forward to the presentation and then the panel. So let me for now hand over to Max for the main findings of the report, then the panel, and there'll be plenty of time for you to ask questions before we discuss more over drinks from 6 o'clock. So Max, over to you.
Thank you, Adrian, and thank you all for coming. This is a culmination of a years-long study into the standard of living in the UK, but really more than that, it's been a culmination of a lot of research over the last few years, looking into how the cost of living crisis has developed over time, analysing how specific policies in a moment can influence people's standard of living. And what we wanted to do with this research is put all of that together and take a really comprehensive look at why we are not as rich as we potentially should be. So I want to thank, as Adrian has already mentioned, everybody who's contributed to this research, but also everybody who's contributed to that mission over the last few years. Some of you will know this is actually my last day working at NIESR, so I can say with confidence that this is definitely the culmination of everything that I've learnt. And I encourage you again to read the acknowledgement section of our work, because there's plenty of people, some of which are in the room and some who are not, who have helped us with that work over time. So without further ado, I would like to show you what we found about why we are not better off, with a clicker that's going to hopefully work. So we would like to tackle this firstly by just starting at the top level, looking at people's income. We are going to show you some pretty stark findings. Some of them, though, will be not very surprising to you at all. They'll be just trying to put things into context about why people feel not particularly well off in the UK. And then we're going to delve down into the components of income, particularly welfare and wages, and look at the key changes over time to explore how they're influencing people's standard of living today. So I mentioned that there are some pictures that you've seen before. If you are keen on living standards research and you are avid readers of our economic outlook, you've probably seen this chart before. This shows you real disposable income, that is essentially your income adjusted for the cost of living over time. So it going up means that we are getting better off, and it has done so for nearly half a century. From 1955 up until 2008, you've seen that consistent increase over time. However, after 2008, you see a stagnation. In fact, we've highlighted here where we would have been had we kept up with our pre-2008 average, and we compare that to where we are today, and you can see that stark fall off from where arguably we should be by our own historical standards. But why? We've seen this picture before from NIESR and other organizations, and we want to explore in this project what are the primary drivers behind this and what can we learn from this to try and amend the situation going forward. We're going to do so by looking at this through an international scope, comparing UK regions not just to the UK average, but to wider Europe to try and understand this trend. And then we're going to hopefully prescribe some policies that can alleviate this situation going forward. So, without further ado, let's answer the first question, which is this part of a global trend since a global 2008 financial crisis, or is this part of a sort of more UK-specific factor? So here we're showing you in 2010 what living standards looked like across European regions, including the UK. This picture hasn't been seen before because this data doesn't actually exist for the UK. So this might be just a bit of insight that you might not have seen before into how we compare internationally. And here you can see in the dark blue areas that we compare very favorably. Parts of London and the south east compare pretty favorably to parts of Germany, the richest parts of Germany, and the richest parts of Italy. However, our poorest parts compare closer to that of Slovenia. So that stark difference is laid out pretty bare here for you to see. But this is in 2010. So did the situation get better by 2021? I'm going to shock you and say no. This is the same picture, but you can see a couple of things that have changed now. Firstly, UK regions got a bit better off, but the worse off ones got more worse off. So that inequality grew in the UK. And just wanted to draw your attention as well to Eastern Europe. You can see here, if I actually am just going to go back one and go back to 2010, if you just focus on, say, Poland, you can see that Poland was doing pretty badly compared to the rest of Europe. And we go back to 2021, it's looking much better, especially in the cities. Same with Bulgaria and other Eastern European nations. We want to explore potentially why that is. Not fully within this project, we can't look at every single country, but there's some things that are worth looking at. So let's just put that into context. Here you see every single region in Europe put side by side and ranked in order of development and living standards since 2010. Most of them increased their standard of living, apart from pretty much every single one of them in Greece, which is on the left-hand side there, which is negative, shows a contraction. And on the right-hand side, those regions in Eastern Europe are the ones that have developed the best. And I've highlighted in red here the UK regions, in particular North Inner London West, which is in the sort of top half, but the majority are in the bottom half. I've highlighted Cumbria here. A lot of regions in Scotland have seen a contraction relative to the European growth rate. So we are increasing, but at a slower rate to the rest of Europe. This is that same picture, but now just put in a slightly different way, so you can see how our regions compare. So the ones on the left-hand side are your poorer regions, the ones on the right-hand side are your more well-off regions. And you can see that the spread in the UK is pretty wide. And if you compare that to, say, let's have a look at Austria at the top, you can see that that spread is much narrower and they are wealthier. Just to flag as well, we've also adjusted this for purchasing power, currency, all the things that could influence this result. So this is as close as you can get to a like-for-like comparison. So there are parts in the UK, this is actually the West Midlands, which is the worse off region, is worse off than the worse off part of Slovenia. And this is why. Here you're looking at the development in real incomes, again, that same figure that you saw at the beginning, but now we're seeing them side by side to how every other country compared. And you can see at 2008, obviously there was a pretty strong contraction and a stagnation afterwards. And we've highlighted a couple of countries here that you can see, particularly Finland and France, they kept growing. So they didn't have that same kink in 2008 as the UK did. We're also just showing the poorest households here. This does also track for pretty much everyone in the country, but we wanted to just really put the poorest households into context here. And a consequence of that stagnation is that Slovenia and Malta, which started well behind the UK at the start of this data series here, have now overtaken the UK standard of living. So that chimes with the previous chart that you've seen. So naturally, we want to understand why this is, and we're going to, as I said, delve into the key components of income, which is wages and welfare, starting with welfare. Firstly, let me just tackle a bit of a myth about the UK welfare state. Some of you will know that this is a bugbear of mine, that people like to assume that the UK is a high welfare country. It's really not. Here we're showing you welfare spending as a percentage of total GDP, so it's the size of your economy. And the UK, just in total, for total welfare spending, ranks right in the middle here at 20%. We've also broken this down by its component, by its program. So a lot of people often assume that welfare is unemployment benefit. You can see here that unemployment benefit is a pretty small part of this. It's mostly pensions and incapacity benefits, of which are very topical at the moment. So this is in 2019. But let's look at how it changed since 2010. So here you can see total welfare spending, but just the comparison between 2010 and 2019. The UK, right at the bottom here, shows the biggest fall in welfare spending in total. And a lot of other countries actually increased their welfare spending since 2010. I want you to hold this fact in your mind, because I'm going to come back to it a little bit later. But here you can just see that the welfare spending has seen quite a strong fall, which shouldn't surprise that many people. So now this is just another way to show that. We're going to look at the welfare programs exclusively, and we're going to compare welfare spending to your average wage. So this is if you were on the average wage and you fell onto welfare, how much of your previous wage would have been sort of covered by welfare. A lot of countries will see around half. So if you're on the average wage, around half of that is usually the typical value of welfare. In the UK, it's 30%, and it's right near the bottom of these OECD large economy countries. There's also been that fall since 2010, so it used to be somewhat less ungenerous, and now is even less generous. So it's right at the bottom and is very similar to the United States, not well known for their social benefit systems. Now, how do they do this is the question I just want to put to you, because a lot of people would assume that the welfare contractions over the 2010s was simply by just reducing the generosity of the welfare programs. Now, while that is somewhat true, I just want to challenge that with this chart here. So in your red line here, you can see relative to the 2000s, what the level of welfare was, what the value of that welfare was over time. There is a bit of a kink when universal credit gets introduced. It's a bit more of a taper in reality because it was introduced slowly, a small technical point. But overall, that you can see that there was a steady increase in the value of welfare. It was uprated every single year. And we put that next to CPIH, which is our, this moves, which is our measure of the cost of living for a particular household. And you can see that prior to the universal credit introduction, that welfare would keep up with that cost of living every single year. But in the last few years, notwithstanding the COVID uplift, you can see that it's struggled to keep up with the cost of living. So that cost of living crisis, I know it's a very small part of this graph, but is reflected right there. So you see that welfare is uprated right in line with the cost of living for that particular day, but then prices continue rising and your welfare is suddenly out of date really quickly. This is a theme that came out pretty strongly in the report that you hopefully will have with you from our peer researchers, who mentioned how the cost of living suddenly strips away from their welfare as soon as it gets uprated. So it's fine for a day, but it's not for the day after. Now, the reason I asked you earlier to remember that welfare contracted strongly in the UK, you're probably wondering if it fell so much, but in value it went up, how did they do so? And the reason and the answer is through creating a stricter system that pushed people off welfare much faster than otherwise. So that is the way in which welfare has been reduced in this country without necessarily changing the sort of headline generosity of welfare. Now, putting all of that together, we wanted to just highlight what the Joseph Rowntree Foundation have calculated as the cost of essentials next to the value of universal credit. So you can see here for a single household and a couple, they all spend a lot of money on these essentials, particularly energy and food. Neither household type will see their universal credit be higher than the cost of essentials. And again, this was a key theme that came out in our peer researcher work. We saw that a lot of people said that they had to borrow from their family, borrow from their friends, borrow from a bank, and they're constantly having to use alternative sources to cover the cost of essentials. Now, the welfare state is supposed to be a safety net, and clearly here we're seeing that it is not fulfilling its objectives. So here we're just taking that 2024 figure and just moving it back through time. And you can see that that picture has been pretty consistent. Other than 2 years, 2020, 2021, you saw that universal credit finally covered the cost of essentials with that £20 per week uplift, a really valuable change that had an influential impact on people's living standards. And again, it meant that the peer researchers that we spoke to could finally save money, which they currently can't do. However, it was taken away, and it was taken away at a time when inflation was rising the fastest. Now, in there you notice that housing wasn't included. Housing benefit is a slightly different system, so we're going to have a look at that now. Here you are looking at the yearly change in rental costs by region. Just to make this easy to interpret, I put all the regions in one, so that's shaded pink areas reflecting all those different regions, and that's your range. And I've highlighted London. We've taken out the Northern Ireland because it's a bit of an outlier, so that you can see the picture. But the most important thing to get from this is that in the last few years, the increase in rental costs has been some of the strongest on record. So our historic peak in this data was 6%, and London in particular, the last point of this data set was 8%. Northern Ireland is at 10%. So we are well above our peak. Now, why does this matter not just for private renters? Why does this matter for people on welfare? It's because the housing benefit system has changed, or rather it hasn't changed by very much. So if you look here, this is our percent of the UK that is affordable on housing benefit. Now, housing benefit has been frozen in cash value for quite some time. Up until 2020, it was frozen in cash value in this series that you're looking at. And because of that rental increase that you've just seen, there was a small but noticeable deterioration in the areas of the country that are affordable on housing benefit. It was reset and it was increased in 2020. And you can see, thankfully, we're coming back up again. So around 20% was affordable. But again, it was frozen in cash terms. And you've seen in those last 3 years and that was the strongest for increases in rental costs. So that's where you see this really strong fall. And the consequence of this is that around 5% of the country is affordable on housing benefit, which is basically impossible to find a home. This is one of the most key themes that has come out from our peer researcher work, who have mentioned how difficult it is in their area, everywhere, to find a home. We also know that in particular places like Kensington and Chelsea, that is around 1%. So it is virtually impossible to find a home, and hopefully we'll talk about that in a moment. So here's that same view, but just across the country, so you can see that regionally. 2020, the blue areas are sort of more affordable, around 30%. We see much more affordability in places like Scotland and the northeast. And then by 2022, we see a pretty consistent fall everywhere. One thing I just want to highlight is something we've really learned from working with peer researchers. From a quantitative perspective, I've showed you that 2020 is a really good year and 2022 is a really bad year. If you ask peer researchers which year was better, they'll say neither, because people who actually have experience with trying to get a home on housing benefit, they don't really see it in those terms. 20% is really low So 5% is just impossible. So for people on the ground who this impacts, it's all pretty tricky. So that's welfare. So we're now going to look at wages, which is sort of for the majority is the source of people's standard of living. And we're going to reevaluate those charts. This one, again, that you've sort of seen, but now, unlike that first chart where we're looking at overall incomes, we're just going to look at wages. And again, you see that nice consistent story up until 2008 and then a stagnation afterwards. But again, why is this the case? So we're going to spend some time exploring exactly why. Now, if you've been to a NIESR event before, you would have heard us talk endlessly about productivity to a point where some of you may even wonder, why does it really, really matter? Why does everyone really care about productivity? And this is why. So just before I actually get in there, let me just explain what productivity is for anyone who doesn't know. Productivity is what we produce with what we have. So it's GDP with every hour that you work. So holding constant the amount of people who are working, what are we producing with what we've got? So we want to get more efficient with our production, and that's productivity. So the countries that have seen the greatest increases in productivity, particularly in those Eastern European countries, you're sensing a theme here, had the greatest increases in real wages, so wages adjusted for the cost of living. So there is such a strong relationship because your wages are really a function of how productive you are. So if you put yourself in the mind of a business owner, if your workforce increases their production without you having to do anything, their value has gone up and you're going to have to pay them more, otherwise they'll go somewhere else. That's why this matters. So we wanted to look at, going back to this chart here, how much of this stagnation is explained by the slowdown in productivity. Because as you saw earlier, the UK is currently ranking pretty unfavorably for productivity, and we used to rank pretty highly. So this, I could lay them side by side, but I think we've had one too many charts already. We could see that productivity and wages basically track together. Productivity after 2008 also stagnated. So let's see, based on our estimates, how much of this slowdown is also explained by productivity. It's around half. So just on productivity alone, if we'd kept up with our pre-2008 growth rate in productivity, the average worker in the UK would be £4,300 better off straight away. You may be asking what's in the other section. We can get a little bit techy about this. Mostly that will be the labour share of income and changes in capital productivity too. But this is the sort of most influential part of productivity. This is the bit that the government will be thinking very clearly about in trying to influence so that we can see better standard of living for all. For those of you who don't believe me, what I've done here is I've taken the US growth rate in wages since 2008 and layered it onto UK wages in 2008. And so another way of putting this is if we'd kept up with US wage growth, here's what our wage growth would have looked like. Now, the US was one of the only countries that arguably didn't have as much of a productivity crisis as elsewhere. So they're kind of your golden example of a country that's increasing their productivity over time. And you see that it tracks pretty neatly against our scenario. So this was a little check to make sure that we're on the right page, but I wanted to show you this just in case no one believed me. And as a result of this, we can also then see that if we had kept up with US wage growth, we would also be £4,000 per year better off. So there's a lot of money on the table here, purely as a consequence from increasing productivity. So let's put this story of wages, stagnant increases in real incomes, and welfare all together into one very busy chart. So at the bottom here, you can see that same picture for welfare generosity, how much welfare is compared to the average wage. And on the left-hand side, the y-axis, you can see wage growth over time, or wages rather, in levels. And you can see that in the sort of bottom left quadrant, you've got countries that have low welfare and low wages, particularly Greece. Top right, which is where you want to be, arguably, or anyway, top right is higher welfare and higher wages, so a strong social safety net and good wage opportunities from the labour market. The UK is not a high welfare country, and it is certainly not a high wage country as a result. So people often assume that there is a sort of friction between welfare and wages. Not quite sure that that's supported by this chart, but you can certainly take the view that the UK is not experiencing decent living standards from either source for the poorest households. So, with all that doom and gloom out of the way, what could we potentially do about this? Now, all of you will know that there is a slight issue with our public finances, so what we want to do is, instead of just saying what you can do to reverse the situation, we want to explore what are the most cost-effective ways. So we're going to look at a range of policies. There's so many here that I won't even explore all of them with you. But we'll highlight a couple, and we're going to compare them to how much they cost to find the most cost-effective ways of reducing poverty and the most cost-effective way of raising people's income. So here's that first one. This is for our analysis into poverty reduction next to the cost. We've used a model called Policy Engine, who are mentioned in the acknowledgements as being a fantastic source of insights. So you can see here, based on that model, the poverty reduction that you expect to see from removing the benefit cap and removing the two-child limit are very strong, some of the strongest, but they rank some of the lowest for cost. So we really wanted to highlight just how cost-effective it is to reduce poverty with those two policy measures. In particular, I would like to just also reframe this debate, and instead of thinking about this as such a cost, we can think about this as such an opportunity. There's been very few opportunities in history where we were able to reduce poverty at such low cost. So I hope that in all the talks about benefit discussions that we can have a think about how we harness that opportunity moving forward. A couple of others to mention here. Essentials guarantee is essentially just raising welfare in line with what the Joseph Rowntree Foundation estimate to be a sufficient level for covering the costs of essentials. You can see here that also ranks very highly for poverty reduction. It also influences a lot of people, so it's slightly on the more expensive side, but it's worth sort of highlighting here. There's a whole bunch in the bottom left-hand corner. I'm going to highlight the winter fuel allowance for no particular reason, as being pretty ineffective at reducing poverty, but it's also lower on the cost side. There's a couple of tax cuts in the top left-hand corner here, which don't have much of an influence on poverty. For obvious reasons, people who are usually experiencing poverty probably won't be as influenced by changes in tax cuts. But let me move it on to influencing the incomes of the bottom 10% of households. And you can see that tax cut story has slightly changed now. A 1p VAT cut would have quite a strong influence on raising people's disposable incomes, and obviously would cost quite a lot of money because it influences basically everyone, but it's ranking very highly for effectiveness at reducing, or rather increasing people's income. Essentials guarantees basically stayed where it is, and a whole other sort of group of benefits here are on the slightly lower side. But we wanted to include this as a potential roadmap for policymakers and for the general public to understand potentially how these policies could influence the picture that we have presented today. So I will finish there. You have seen lots and lots of charts. Hopefully we can explore some of those charts with the panel. And I believe we have a video set up for the next slide. And the video here is going to be a collection of the reflections from our peer researchers who wanted to read out what was some of it was in the report, some of it actually is in addition, and you're going to hear their voices and hear what they have to say next.
When you're so poor, I can't say you can put one thing above other, because every single thing is a challenge. Everything. It's not that one thing's above other.
I've been in positions where I've not eaten and made sure that my kids have got, food on the plate, and that should not be happening in this day and age.
I don't even buy fruit for my kids anymore, just so I can manage the food expenses. Even then, it's not enough. Ideally, fruit is something they should eat at least once, twice a week, but now I can barely buy it for them every 2 weeks, if at all.
Prices have hiked, even in the cheap supermarkets like Aldi. 1 week the shopping's £100, the next it's nearly £150. Meat, veg, potatoes, all of them have gone up. And wash powder and cleaning products, that's gone ridiculous.
The only place we go is the community shop. It's basically like a supermarket, but it's where supermarkets donate, so stuff that might be going off.
Last winter, before I started working, during the coldest months in January and February, I didn't even turn on the heater.
I have a heating unit and I have to use it carefully. I only turn it on for an hour at night. During the day we stay under blankets and we're all under them. My kids are getting sick quickly because it's so cold. I have to borrow about £100 every month.
I'm just not able to give my child the life that he deserves. I work hard, I work Monday to Friday, and I can't even enjoy my life because I don't have the money to do it.
before I hand over to Joel, and that is, we wouldn't actually be here without UKRI, who I forgot to mention in all my excitement at the beginning. So, first of all, apologies to UKRI. Secondly, we want to thank them extremely warmly for their support over the past year. The UK Research and Innovation, as you know, is the umbrella organization of the research councils, and it is thanks to their support that we've been able to do this work. So that was what I wanted to add to my opening remarks. And now I want to hand over to Joel, who's the specialist business editor of ITV News, very familiar to all of you here in the room, to chair our panel.
ITV viewers, I can tell. Yeah.
Absolutely, without exception. So Joel, over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Max. I thought this report was absolutely superb. I think economics is stories about economics are a really hard sell in the ITV newsroom, let alone to our viewers. Obviously, in recent years, everyone has learned what inflation means, and people have seen how the data that is published by the Office for National Statistics every month actually impacts very directly their everyday lives. People don't think in terms of gross domestic product. They do think in terms of living standards. And I think this report, which we decided to film and cover up in Doncaster, got a really striking response from people because it chimed with their everyday lived experience. I think obviously there are aspects of it which are deeply depressing. It's, when you see recognizable human beings really struggling with their lives, it's quite a hard watch at times. And for the reasons that Max has spelt out, the last 15 years have been really grim in some cases. However, what's uplifting is seeing where organisations within a community rally round, where local authorities, and we'll be hearing from Elizabeth shortly, can really actually catalyse and make a difference, and where actually public policy, even drawn up in Westminster, makes a difference. But the things that occurred to me, again, when you start to speak to the people we heard from at the end of that video there, is that there are certain truths about a debate which sometimes gets lost in Westminster. Some people on incapacity and disability benefit are genuinely very ill. Some people who are out of work are really struggling to find work, and going back to work doesn't actually always make financial sense. So, with that in mind, let us introduce the panel, because we want to hear from all of them. On my left, sporting a wonderful hat, Helen Barnard, Director of Policy, Research and Impact at the Trust. She was formerly Director of the Joseph Rowntree Foundation and Research and Policy Director at Pro Bono Economics. She is a leading national expert on poverty, inequality and social policy. To my right, Elizabeth Campbell, the leader of the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea. Elizabeth has been a councillor since 2006 and was elected leader of the council in 2017. Before being elected leader, she was chair of the Governor's Chelsea Academy until 2017. On the far left, not politically, but Tim Loynig. Professor Tim Loynig is an economist at the London School of Economics, Department of Economic History. He's worked for the UK government for over 10 years, including serving as economic advisor to 2 chancellors, 3 housing secretaries, and as chief analyst and chief scientific advisor at the Department for Education. Now, in government, get this, he invented the UK furlough scheme during COVID.
Well, I stole it from the Germans.
And the post-COVID rent arbitration scheme, and the school's national funding formula. So Tim will bring his experience to the debate too. On the far right of the panel, Adrian Pabst, who's Deputy Director for Social and Political Economy at the National Institute. His research is at the interface of political theory, political economy and public policy, with a focus on institutions. Before joining NIESR, he was head of the School of Politics and International Relations at the University of Kent. And of course, we've heard from Max. Ladies and gentlemen, your panel. Everyone has come armed with something to say briefly. We're going to start with Tim. Tim?
So, oh dear, sorry. I think it'll work without the piece of foam. This is a report of 2 halves about welfare and growth. I was brought up poor, properly poor. My mum was one of those people who didn't eat so that my sister and I ate. I know what it's like to be homeless. I know what it's like to be so cold you can't sleep and your hamster hibernates for the winter. So I fully support and I'm willing to pay any level of tax that is necessary to lift the two-child rule and to get rid of the benefit cap. It is just an abomination that a country as rich as us has so many children suffering like that. But of course, if we're also serious about poverty, we need, as you said, to get rents down. And there is only one sustainable way to get rents down, and that's to build more fucking houses. That's a technical term that you learn when you do a PhD in economics. Because ultimately, it's supply and demand 101. Back in the day, in the 70s, when my mum, with my dad, just before he left, bought a house in Chatham, you could get a 3-bedroom house for, in today's money, about 70,000 quid. Today, that same house is worth 220. And in that sense, poverty is way worse, and it is just supply and demand. And that's why I said yesterday on the radio that Angela Rayner, I'm her #1 fan, and I'm going to put a poster of her on my bedroom wall for the work she's doing to increase building. On the growth side, about which ultimately I think I've been asked to speak, I want to say 2 things that weren't in the presentation. And it's this, that this appears to be a crisis of Western Europe, and the contrast with Eastern Europe is really profound. Now, I remember going by coach, because it was before Ryanair, to Poland in the summer of '94. It's a long way, 24 hours, 36 when the coach breaks down on the way home. And what I saw was a country on the move, a country where people wanted to speak English because they knew it's the language of the future and prosperity. And boy, has capitalism delivered for Poland, as it has for Lithuania. A friend of mine who makes I should have worn a jacket for the occasion, those bits that make jacket collars stiff. They're called fusible interlinings. He made those for Aquascutum, and he moved production from Britain to Lithuania. He told me it was a place with the morals of Sweden and the wage rates of Romanians. And he said with those morals, they won't be poor for long. And so it came to pass. This, it seems to me, as an economic historian, is a study of convergence. We have a common market with Eastern Europe, and so business after business has moved to Eastern Europe. In the 1980s, Britain was the best place to set up a car factory. Nissan came here, Toyota, Honda, BMW bought Mini, etc. No one has opened a car plant in Britain for years. Indeed, Honda pulled out. Where have they opened car plants? Poland, Slovakia. Slovakia makes more cars per head than anyone else in the world. It's a fantastic place to make cars. It's centrally located in Europe, it's part of a big common market, and its wages are low. We can't offer any of those advantages, and that makes me pessimistic. And obviously it's way worse now we've left the EU. But my pessimism is curtailed, because we don't have to reach quite the bottom in Europe to take off, but Poland and Slovakia are getting pretty close to us. And at that point, we'll stop losing jobs. We'll stop losing wages, because there won't be others able to outcompete us from underneath. So my pessimism is bounded by the wages of Eastern Europe. And the fact that they're rising fast tells me that maybe, just maybe, the next 10 years won't be as bad. And if we get the growth, we can then do something about the welfare, because getting people to vote for tax rises is really hard.
Hello.
Right, hello. So just for people who don't know, Trussell, we're a charity, we're an anti-poverty charity. We support a network of about 1,400 food bank centres across the UK. And our goal is to end the need for food banks, because we don't think we should exist. So we provide help in communities today for people who are experiencing hunger and hardship, and we do research and policy and campaigning to try and tackle the underlying causes of why so many people are experiencing that. And there are probably 2 things I wanted to highlight today. I think something that has come out, but I think should be highlighted more, is that deep poverty has really increased in the last particularly 10 to 15 years. So often you look at overall poverty rates and they don't shift that much. But actually underneath that, if you look at destitution, the most extreme form of poverty, that has shot up, particularly in the last 5 to 7 years. You can see exactly the same thing with people having to turn to food banks. So last year, our food banks provided more than 3 million emergency food parcels. And we are only part of the picture. There are loads of independent food banks, so there's even more. So we've seen this deepening of poverty. And we've also seen the groups who are most exposed to that, because of course it's not evenly split. You haven't got the same risk of experiencing that extreme hardship across the population. And the two groups that we see most are families with children, particularly young children. So some of the research we've done suggests about a quarter of kids under 4 are in families facing hunger and hardship who are on incredibly low incomes. And an enormous proportion of people we are seeing at food banks are parents who are at the end of their tether trying to find a way to provide the bare minimum for their kids. The other group are disabled people. So about 3/4 of everyone who comes to Trussell food banks are disabled themselves or in a household with someone who is. Disabled people are at the very sharpest end of poverty in this country. And it's been extreme. So last week, before we knew the sheer scale and horror of what the government appears to be planning on disability benefits, we published some research because we had looked at with YouGov, if you look at people who are on universal credit plus a health and disability benefit, how are they doing? 3/4 of those people are already having to go without essentials. More than 4 in 10 are already missing meals to pay for other essential costs. And about a fifth had to turn to a food bank in the last month. So there was this incredible scale of hardship out there. And then we got the news over the weekend, thanks to Joel's colleagues, among others, that the government was planning these a scale of benefit cuts for disabled people that none of us saw coming. We thought there would be some. We had no idea they would be this big. And people are terrified out there. We are getting messages from people going, I don't know how I'm going to survive. We had one mother who contacted us saying she has stopped being able to afford the pads her disabled son needs or the ointment he needs to help with the pain of his stoma bag. And she's a mum who cannot alleviate her child's pain because we have trapped her in a system where she can't get a job because she's caring full time for her son, and you can't get childcare for disabled kids a lot of the time. And we've trapped her on an income where she can't afford the bare minimum and she is skipping meals, so at least she can give him some food. So that is the situation we're facing. I suppose the final thing, though, is I wanted to end on a note of hope because things are feeling quite bleak. I think the note of hope I would see is that this is one area where the public are remarkably united across party lines. It's been quite interesting doing research with voters, and about 85% of the public agree that if you are somebody who is on social security benefits of whatever kind, you should at least have the income to be protected from hunger, to be able to afford essentials. And that's a real, in a very polarized world, that's a real unifier, that actually, as a society, the public do not want people forced to food banks, and we want to protect one another. The same instinct that has our 40,000 volunteers going to food banks every week to help their neighbours and their community, we can feel that towards the state, which does that protection on a bigger scale. So I suppose I would say that we need to kind of use this analysis, use the experience of the people who shared their stories as this research, and kind of harness that public will to create a system which protects people from hunger, protects them from that kind of hardship. I'll stop there.
Elizabeth.
Thank you. I was very interested when we were looking at the slides when you were sort of saying, well, London is amongst the richest areas in Europe. And I'd say, well, that disguises huge discrepancies within London. So even within Kensington and Chelsea, we have 4 wards we're amongst the poorest in the UK. So you don't really need to go to Doncaster. You can stay here in London. And if I pick up what Helen said about what the essentials are, I would say one of the big essentials is somewhere to live. And that is becoming increasingly problematic in London. So it used to be the fact that you'd have, like Tim was saying, a realistic aspiration to buy your own house, or to buy with council houses, and that became a pipe dream. Then we went to generation rent, and that's increasingly becoming a pipe dream. So there's been a 22% reduction in rental homes. That's a fifth in London over the last 5 years. There are 12 people chasing every home. And as you were saying, Max, only 5% of homes across all of London are available if you're on housing benefit. So that is a huge problem. We've gone from generation rent to generation homeless. One child in every classroom in primary school and secondary school in London is in temporary accommodation. And it's an awful outcome for residents, and it's an awful outcome for councils as well. Because actually, thank you, Angela Rayner, you gave us £250 million nationally to help with temporary accommodation. But if I say London councils are spending £1 billion a year on temporary accommodation, it gives you an idea of the size of the problem. So even in Kensington and Chelsea, where we're £7 million overspent this year, and that's going right across London, and an awful lot of councils are now really teetering on the edge because the government has moved the responsibility for paying for housing benefit really from central government to local government. So for us in KNC, we have the best record in London of trying to prevent homelessness, because the best way to stop people going into accommodation is just to help them stay where they are. We're looking how we do temporary accommodation differently, and that's including trying to see whether we can get institutional investors to help us buy places where we can put people in temporary accommodation, which gives them some security of tenure, and that we can check the quality. And the final thing I'd just like to say is government is obsessed with units. You know, how many, I absolutely agree with you, we do need to build, but it's also what we build. So you can build, at the moment, you say, well, we want to build loads of homes, and everyone looks at how many units. Well, London's awash with one-bedroom and studio flats. What we need is family homes too, and that is a huge problem for us. To go back to what Helen was saying as well, it's a real problem for families.
Good, thank you. Adrian, have you got one or two? We've heard from Max. Is there anything you want to add before we throw over to the floor? I've already got one or two questions, but I think we should hear from people in the room.
Yeah, absolutely. So I will be extremely brief, and I know whenever an academic says that, you start worrying. I'm going to give a lecture. I will not. But really, first of all, again, a huge thanks to everyone here. I thought those testimonies from people who have that lived experience, was extraordinarily sobering, and it again really reflects also what's just been said by Tim, Helen, and Elizabeth. So thank you, because I think by bringing together quantitative and qualitative evidence, I think we're getting a better picture of just how stark this decline has been for millions of people. And I suppose the one thing I want to say is, there is really no point in us just thinking in aggregate terms. Oh, if only the average was a bit higher, it'd be okay. It won't, because it doesn't affect people in those income decards. We really need to be very granular in terms of the distributional side of things. Who is really affected? Where in the country are they affected? Again, the myth that somehow, London and the southeast are very prosperous, so it's okay. We should just focus on other parts. No, it's at the level of wards, as Elizabeth has said. Yeah, that's where the disparities are. So what that means for policies, it has to be targeted. It has to be tailored. It cannot be general subsidies. We can debate, what we should have done with energy prices, but our view at NIESR always was, yes, help people, but don't help everyone in the same way. Why should you be subsidizing the energy bills of people who can afford to pay more? Right? And that's what we did, and we spent billions of pounds on that could have been used to help people who really need it at the other end of the income distribution. So it's about targeted, tailored policy interventions. That's what we're interested in. When it comes to housing, where you build them, what units, because just as London needs family homes, places that are seeing lots of house building activity, like for instance Cambridge, are building only family homes and not units for instance people who are single people households. For instance, the young researchers who might be working at the university can't afford to buy because it's just family homes, and their salaries will not allow them to buy or even to rent. So where we build, what we build, the transport connections to get people to jobs, so that actually it's a realistic option to say you could work, you want to work, let's help you do it. Where the transport connections in so many parts of the country. And then, of course, crucially also, which skills, where in the country, etc. So it's really about the tailored, targeted policy interventions with a very, very strong focus on place-based interventions. That's the only way we're going to get this right. Not general subsidies. They have been a disaster in terms of the use of scarce public resources. Thank you.
Perfect. You've heard the thoughts of the panel. Let's hear your thoughts. Does anyone have anything they want to contribute or any questions that you want to ask? I've got a gentleman here with his hand up. Can I ask, we have got a microphone that will come to you momentarily. If you could just introduce yourself, please, say who you are before you ask the question.
Yeah, I'm Bernard Casey, retired academic, ex-OECD economist and other things. I was thinking of the policy options at the end, and it's something which a little bit Adrian and also Tim mentioned. When you presented a graph of policy options, there were a number of policies there, but one of them was not investment in people, education. This is the kind of issue which is associated with what might we do about disability benefits, and it's possibly the softening of the Starmer presentation that we've heard over the last day or two. But where do things like investments come in? Because where does investment in education, where does investment in training come in? Or also following Adrian's point as well, things like investment in transport, which gets those people, if they have got skills, to the right place. Those kind of policies don't feature here, and I don't understand where they would feature. And indeed, we come back to the whole question, which, I mean, I'm aware that the current government has been discussing when it has been looking at, I mean, what do we understand by national assets? What do we understand by national wealth? How does, you know, sort of how does expenditure versus investment get measured? So can we have any discussion of that? Thanks.
Max, Adrian, do you want to pick up on that first of all in terms of the coverage? Where's the investment in skills? Where's the investment in transport?
There's always a challenge with these graphs of not putting too much on because I already put enough. And in fact, the investment story would have made it impossible to see everything else because it would have been probably the most expensive. But to speak to your point, one of the things that you haven't mentioned, though, is fiscal rules. And we've mentioned a bit about planning already. These are not necessarily policies that you can cost, but they would release an awful lot of money. In fact, let's just think about the disability changes to benefits that have been trailed in the media so far. Arguably, the reason that we're having this discussion is because we've had a couple of data points of pretty weak growth, weaker than we were expecting, and now we have to cut welfare. I mean, let's just take a moment to appreciate how ridiculous the system is when we are having to make those kinds of social policy changes because the rules make us do so because of a few noisy data points. So that would be certainly something I would be putting in there, but it would be on the zero end of the spectrum in terms of cost, arguably. Secondly, which is, again, harder to sort of present in this chart, we talk a lot about trying to increase productivity through investment, and I'm sure plenty of people on the panel are qualified to talk about that. But there's something I just wanted to mention, which is that the productivity slowdown happened immediately in 2008. It was marked. And investment and influencing productivity would happen with a bit of a lag. So there's a bit of unexplained phenomena here, is why did investments influence the productivity slowdown so cleanly and so uniquely? I would argue that it's not the only story here. The other story that is worth mentioning is actually how we structure welfare compared to the wider labour market itself. We have a system where we have a pretty inflexible labour market, so people can expect to be pretty secure in their jobs. And the quid pro quo is that, you know, well, we don't need to have a strong safety net because you're unlikely to ever use it. Some other countries will do it the other way around, where they'll say, look, the economy might move on without you, and it may catch you out. And as a result, we're going to have a pretty generous system to make sure that you're not in a too difficult position for too long. So those policies in there may also influence productivity in the long run, but we don't often think about it in those terms. So that would be my challenge back to you. I'll leave it there.
Tim, did you want to pick up on that? You were laughing at one moment.
Well, I certainly wasn't trying to laugh at the question, which is a valid one. Skills are generally good for getting people from minimum wage to median, or median to mean and beyond, but they're not a particularly good way of getting people out of abject poverty. Those people tend to have other reasons why they're in poverty. So they're suffering from disability, they have children, they can't get childcare, etc. So I think in answer to your question, Bernard, skills, whilst they're terribly important, they're not really the answer here.
thank you for clarifying, Bernard. I mean, on the point about abject poverty, Tim, you were mentioning the benefit cap. I am conscious that obviously the NIESR makes some policy recommendations, and they do involve spending quite a lot of money. Taking off the two-child limit, NIESR says, would cost around £2 billion a year. And then I think removing the benefit cap, is that right? Mm-hmm. Max, is going to cost around £7 billion a year? Is that the sort of
whatever the chart
So 2 billion. It's 2 billion. Each is 2 billion.
Each is
on my
2
reading
billion.
Of the chart.
I mean, if you've advised two chancellors, this chancellor would tell you that's not affordable.
Well, that's just silly. There are so many things on which we spend 2 billion. We currently subsidise the railways by 11 billion a year. You know what? If push comes to shove, I know which one of those I'll take. We spend 2 billion a year from memory on things like universal infant free school meals. I will take free meals from the middle class rather than have child poverty any day. I will get rid of free prescriptions for affluent people aged 60 to 65 any day. I will pay more taxes myself. We spend 2 billion a year on the subsidies for creative arts graduates. We have completely unlimited numbers of people allowed to do creative arts, and the losses on those loans are 2 billion a year. So how many 2 billions a year do you want me to offer you?
I mean, something else that's worth saying is that we always cost the policies. We tend not to cost the inaction of not doing some of these policies. So we've got some research which we've been doing with WPI Economics, which is coming out in a few weeks, where we have basically said what is the cost to the country of having the levels of deep poverty we are allowing to exist. So we've costed, what's the cost to the NHS of the fact that people are getting iller and iller and rocking up at A&E? What's the cost to education services, to social care? What is the cost in lost wages because of the damage that this level of hardship does? And I'm not going to scoop our own thing, but it is in the billions and billions. It massively outweighs any of these policies. So we need to find a way to make visible the cost of allowing this to continue, because we're so good at costing the solutions and we're not good at costing just doing nothing.
Can I come in on that? I mean, the government's thing today of taking 50% out of the NHS. Well, for local authorities, we have combined pots of money to look after children with disabilities. And if I tell you at the moment in Kensington, Chelsea, we're doing a judicial review of the NHS because they're refusing to pay their part for 10 of our children who have really severe disabilities. And so all my social workers are looking in the paper thinking, oh my God, if this is the problem we have now, what's it going to be like if the NHS is shrinking even further? You know, we share the care.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's go back to the floor. Another question, please. Gentleman here at the front with the glasses, just round here, Neil, with a jacket and a grey blue, my eyesight isn't what it was, shirt. There we are, beautiful.
Hi, I'm Paul Fisher. I'm a governor at the National Institute, amongst many other things. First of all, can I just thank the panel? It's not often I've sat listening to a panel that actually agreed with everything that's said. It's brilliant. I mean this.
Secondly, don't worry.
One complaint about the paper. Could we please stop projecting pre-2008 growth rates on from 2008? It's an unsustainable rate of growth from the peak of a boom. It's not right. It's not useful. And lots of people do it. If you project on from 2000 at the previous 10 years rate, you'll get a much more useful counterfactual to compare with. The point of interest I wanted to ask about was stimulated by your figure 2.1, which compares the welfare spending by programme across countries. And we're in the middle at 20%, and France is at the top at 31. And of that 11 points difference, 8 is on old age spending. And that made me think, what sort of system do we really want? We know France has an unsustainable pension position, it can't increase its pension age. But do we actually want a situation in which we spend a lot more on old age welfare in terms of pensions, or do we actually want private pensions, concentrating our pension spend on those who couldn't afford to get private pensions? I get a pension, state pension, I don't know why, I don't need it, I've got my private pension. Why not take it away from me and give it to somebody who really needs it? It's not obvious to me that having 14% rather than 6% on old age welfare, if that's multi-pensions, is the right thing to do. And yet the chart implies that if you're at the top somehow it's better. So what do we really want? The question shortly is, should we means test the state pension and divert the money to better forms of welfare?
Perfect. Okay, first of all, it's your chart. NIESR, do you want to come back on that?
I mean, there's a couple of times that we do that. The growth rate prior goes back a long, long time. So I wouldn't necessarily take the point that it was an unsustainable growth boom. Particularly the first one goes back to 1955. So, you know. Okay. We'll take a slightly different view. I think if you have a trend that goes back half a century, then I would take the view that that is a sort of a counterfactual that I would take. On the welfare spending, higher welfare spending is not necessarily a good thing. If you have a good welfare system that is particularly targeted and is providing people with the safety net, then that's fine. There's no implication that it's better. The challenge I would put to you, though, is that you said that, okay, well, we can make this amendment to a particular part of welfare to try and make it more affordable. My question is, why? What problem necessarily are we trying to solve? Are we just trying to reduce our welfare spending so that we can meet our fairly arbitrary fiscal rules? Or are we actually trying to amend something to make it stronger and better and more targeted? That's fine, but it does seem to be, especially today, that we're picking between welfare policies and we're very happy to make some sort of adjustment that may have a pretty negative impact on people's living standards just because of a fiscal rule that's hanging over us and that debt burden, which is, I think, a little bit short-sighted. So I don't know whether we really need to make those kind of changes because I'm not yet convinced that there is a particular problem that we're trying to solve. Just very quickly, we're talking a lot about trying to get people into work, and let's just pretend for a moment that amending disability benefits gets people into work. I don't think I would take that view, but let's just pretend like it does. The UK has a pretty active labour market. We have one of the most active workforces in the world. Unemployment's around 4%. If you ask any economist here, you will all tell you that you can't really get it any lower than 4%. That's virtually full employment. Inactivity is some of the lowest in the OECD. We should be really proud of our workforce and actually talking up British workers as being some of the most active in the world. Why are we having this discussion about trying to change welfare to get people into work? Welfare is not particularly high, and our labour market is. So anyway, I would just challenge you and suggest that, why do we need to make these changes? I'm not yet convinced that we really need to.
Okay, Elizabeth, Helen, Tim, do you want to pick up on do any of you want to pick up on the question about means testing the state pension? Do you think that's a good idea? Tim?
We're about to see a big rise, I think, in pensioner poverty. Because for current pensioners, they're almost all divided into owner-occupiers who own their home outright, including my mum, who was never better off than when she was retired, even though her income was £11,000 a year. And people, in the olden days, they were either that or they were social tenants, and again, they had very low rents. We're getting an increasing number of old people in the private rented sector who are very vulnerable to rent rises and could be absolutely in terrible position, and particularly if their rent is above the local housing allowance. And I think that is a crisis that is coming up over the next 10 or 20 years that the current system is not well suited to, but that means testing the pension wouldn't be the answer to either. So no, I think getting middle-aged people and younger people on the housing ladder so that they can have a comfortable retirement, even if we stopped the triple lock, that will be a sensible way to diffuse that time bomb that's coming. But yeah, the triple lock has to end at some point, for sure.
Helen?
Yes. So I think I would go back to that question of purpose. What are we trying to achieve with each bit of our system? And with the part of the pension system, presumably what we want is for people who retire to all be able to have a reasonable standard of living, and we should have a conversation about what that is. What you then need is actually what happened with the Turner Commission, where it's all been forgotten, but they came up with a formula that here is the level that the state should guarantee, and this is what we think private pensions will do to top it up, and this is the trajectory. Trouble is, they didn't know that they wrote that report at the height of the home ownership boom and that it was downhill from there. So the whole system was set up without realising we were going to see massively more pensioners renting into older age. We have seen and the other thing I say is the fall in pensioner poverty is one of the biggest policy successes this country has ever had. We took a decision as a country that having incredibly high pensioner poverty was a bad thing and we would fix it, and we fixed it. That's great. We're now slowly undoing that success, as with child poverty. But we can do that again, but you need to make a purposeful decision. And yes, the triple lock is balmy. It's an uprating mechanism that has no anchorage anywhere. But the anchorage we need, as with the working age system, is what do we want to achieve? Do we want to achieve everyone can afford essentials? Okay, let's design a system that does that.
Would you means test the state pension, Elizabeth?
Well, it depends how much, if you spend more money means testing it than you put out. That's the trouble, isn't it? That's why everyone has sort of blanket policies, because it's cheaper to do it that way. I think it's very hard on the young. I think it's all very well having fantastic pensions for the elderly, but the elderly are getting more and more and more of them, and less of the young, and the burden falls on the young. So I absolutely don't agree that we should carry on the triple lock of the state pension, actually. I think it's too great a burden for those who are working.
Adrian.
Yeah, just two quick thoughts. I mean, one is, I think, Paul raises a really important question about, do we want to keep on, funding people who don't necessarily need public support, right? I mentioned about energy prices earlier. I think there is a question over whether there should be perhaps some limit, and it could be a taper. It doesn't have to be a cut-off point like, the government's done with the winter fuel allowance. Maybe a taper is the better idea. So let's at least, throw that into the mix and not necessarily keep on, paying people who
Does the
generally don't
state
need
pension support people who don't need
Well, hang on. The only thing with a taper is you risk encouraging early retirement. If you tell me that if I quit early on a small pension, I will get 12.5 grand for life, you've given me a really good incentive to quit the labour market. That's bad for GDP, it's bad for tax revenues, it's bad for absolutely everything. So be careful where you go there, Adrian.
No, absolutely. I think that's a really, really good rejoinder, Tim. I mean, the other thing I was going to say is, yes, let's think about, general, provision versus means testing. But I think the fundamental point is, we're seeing fiscal drag since 2021 when the personal allowance was set at 12,570 and hasn't been revised since. Now, the government are saying, we're going to do in April 2028. Well, I don't know whether that's with a view to an election or not, and I think such a thing as pre-election tax cut, I think that's happened before in the history of British politics, so, let's see. But why not start doing that earlier? Because that would mean not more people are dragged into tax, and that includes pensioners. There'll be lots of pensioners who are having to pay tax because they're now going to be, above the 12,570.
Okay, but we have disagreement on the panel, which is great, and it's what you wanted. It's got spicy. The gentleman here, could we bring the microphone over in the, I'm not the useless descriptions, of blue top with an arrow on wing. There we are.
Hi, thank you. My name's David. I'm an economist and a former civil servant. I too had a question about the policy choices charts, and I wondered what scope there is within Policy Engine to consider some of the trade-offs that you might need to consider to fund some of the things that seem like very laudable policies, like the Essentials Guarantee. Could you take some of the things the government can do, considering it set itself a number of constraints, like perhaps just letting tax thresholds be frozen? And could you also consider some things that perhaps Tim's mentioned that might be a bit more, if not radical, but things that, they might have to consider, like means testing certain types of spending? Is that something that you could consider or have considered or could take this one step further?
The simple answer is I'm not the representative of the Policy Engine. He's actually sat behind you. So that's very handy. Sorry to put you on the spot. So perhaps it's a conversation for you two later. I will just say that throughout this research and others, that Policy Engine has some of the greatest capabilities for looking at exactly what you've suggested. So you can go straight into particular government departments and see where you can raise money and what distributional consequences of it. But anyway, sorry to put you on the spot, Nikhil, but he's right behind you.
I'm happy to speak later. It seems to me that there's certain things the government could do in, like, the constraints. It's pledged not to raise the main taxes. Mm-hmm. What would that mean if you were to say, consider something around, as I say, like freezing tax thresholds? And what would that have an effect on, alongside funding something which would also have, positive effects like the Essentials Guarantee?
Just very briefly, you can see there that the unfreezing it is costed, so you can sort of think about that in reverse partly. But yes, you can have a chat with it.
Perfect. Thank you, David. Lady down here on the right with the pink hair. Yes.
I'm going to do a 1-minute contribution, not question. Last time, I'm Jeanette Corker, member, and last time I came to NIESR, I was me and my daughter have been home in temporary accommodation for 17 years, and it's really nice because I like Peabody, because I like banking, and we were housed in Kensington and Chelsea in Peabody about 2 weeks ago. So thank you.
Thanks for sharing that, Jeanette. That was lovely. Thank you. Anything else from the floor? Gentleman, young man there, pink shirt and glasses. There we are, Luca, just next to you. Perfect. And could we get we'll take two, you as well, we'll take 2 questions, one after the other. Yes, please. That's it. Oh, yes, if you could, gentleman with the brown jacket, just there. There we go, perfect. So 2 questions. You, sir, first. If you just introduce yourself and give us your question, and then you, sir, your question.
Hi, I am Jonah Monday, an economic advisor for the Government Office for Equality and Opportunity. And I welcome more of the focus on living standards rather than pure raw GDP growth. But I would be interested to know how the link between those 2 things looks and whether we actually ever see increases in living standards without the growth side by side. And related to that 4-box grid of policy options, in one of them, there were only 2 options in the cheap but effective. In the other, there were none. Yeah. So can we actually afford to take any of these measures until we get the growth that enables us to?
Perfect. And you, sir?
Yes, I'm Robert Morland. I was an economist. You can hear me? So, Robert Morland, I was an economist for a firm of chartered accountants. I should also confess I did have a political career. And I have to say, in the ward that I represented, I had really very few problems of what we're talking about, because I think you would know when I say my ward was actually Knightsbridge, which is not exactly full of people on social security. But my question really is, isn't the bottom line on all this the question of productivity? And if anything, we have underestimated it. I can remember when I was a student, we were taught, and I was, one of my tutor actually won a Nobel Prize for economics, that basically the problem of the UK was its lack of productivity. Well, I was at university more than a few years ago, 60 years, and it's been the same, and we failed and failed to tackle it.
Is there a question?
That is it. Don't you agree?
Okay, okay. Let's start with productivity then. Tim, how do we raise, you were in government, you advised 2 chancellors, productivity.
I did. I wrote my PhD on productivity, and I was also taught by a Nobel Prize winner, and it's very hard. And productivity, I've forgotten which Nobel Prize winner said that productivity isn't everything, but it's almost everything. Krugman, thank you. But it isn't quite everything. We could, as a nation, spend 2 billion more on getting rid of the benefit cap, just as we chose to spend more on pensioners and get rid of pensioner poverty, or reduce it dramatically. We should never think that we don't have a choice. We always have a choice within any framework as to the distribution of income, within reason. You can't tax the rich so much because then they all emigrate, etc. You have to tax the middle class, people bluntly like the people on the panel and the people in the room. You're the guys who either have to pay more tax or the poor suffer. That's the harsh reality. What can we do on productivity? Well, the main thing we could do is rejoin the European Union. Britain is an investment hostile place until we do that. Who would want to open a car plant in a country that has no long-term sustainable ability to export its cars? We need to be serious about the things we're good at. Universities, teaching people English, tourism, the City of London, the sort of economic consultancy for which I work part-time, and so on and so forth. Those are the jobs that we're good at in Britain. It's no good pretending we're good at steel. The cheapest form of energy now worldwide is solar. So in the medium term, all energy intensive industries are going to leave places like Britain and Germany and Poland, and they will go to places like esoteric like Iceland, they'll go to the west side of Texas, and they'll go to Spain. You need to be realistic about this. You need to accept some of those realities about global prices, and you need to adapt to them. We're good at integrating immigrants, we're good at the English language, we need to build on both of those.
Anyone on the panel? Jonah's question. Can we raise living standards without raising growth? Is that possible? Max, Adrian?
I just wanted to add that, so there's one of the charts there that you see the relationship between productivity and people's living standards vis-a-vis wages. You could swap out the productivity measure for simply GDP because they are basically one and the same. So absolutely, it's one of the reasons I put it in there is because there is a bit of a concern that there is this sort of popular, trendy opinion to hold that GDP doesn't matter for people's living standards, and it absolutely does. You can see there that weak productivity growth is costing workers an awful lot of money. So absolutely GDP growth matters here. Another way we can also think about this is how people's living standards can also improve productivity. This is where this conversation around, if you have a decent welfare state that has good social security safeguards in it, it enables people to take risks in their life, and risks actually make GDP in the future. So living standards also relates to your economy, and having these good social safety nets aren't just good because they're the moral thing to do, which is arguably the most important, but they can also be the most important economically.
So GDP is absolutely necessary, but it's not a sufficient condition, because you could imagine GDP going up in aggregate terms, but not everyone benefiting, and that's the whole point, right? That we need to look at the distributional dynamics. And if people in the lowest income decile, the poorest 10%, or indeed the poorest 20%, or during the cost of living crisis, the poorest 40%, are disproportionately hit by shocks because they're spending a lot more of their budget on essentials, and therefore, are really struggling, then we could have, relatively strong growth, and yet the benefits would not be shared in such a way that these people benefit nearly enough. So yes to growth, but growth has to be equitable. It can't just be, high, because most likely the wealthiest will benefit from high growth, not the poorest.
Helen?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And there is something for me about people set up kind of market capitalism versus government redistribution as if they are opposed. And actually, what is successful internationally and nationally at reducing poverty is when you have well-regulated market capitalism, plus a government that is willing to have strong policies to protect people, to redistribute some of the proceeds. So you have to have both.
Obviously, the national government is thinking about how it can raise productivity, growth, living standards. Elizabeth, is there anything that you're, on a local authority level, is there anything that you're doing in this space that you think you could make a difference?
Yeah, I think when we're looking at raising living standards, I think I come back again to housing, just trying to make people have a settled home. And that's really looking at institutional investment where we don't have any money, but attracting into using our pension fund, for example, for buying things, for talking to registered providers to make sure that we get more nominations, like this lady here, who's come to live in KNC with Peabody, home ownership, and again, prevention. So if you're really thinking about living standards, we're really trying to prevent people from being evicted. So that's talking to landlords, that's talking to them and seeing what we can do with them, but then we're also talking to people holding tenancies, saying, well, have you been to the Money Cafe? Have you maximized all the benefits you can have? Do you understand what you can get from this or that? We also do direct payments to residents to try and keep them in their homes, just to stop the slide going down. So that's on the one hand of housing, then with employment. Because again, in Kensington and Chelsea, we've got fantastic employers and people who employ lots of people, like Harrods and a lot of floor staff. So it's really being a convening power between our employers and unemployed, and also appreciating that, for example, if you're going to have an apprenticeship scheme, we will now look at paying employers to take apprenticeships, but at the same time, understanding that some of those apprenticeships will fail unless you support the apprentice. They have to have, support as well.
Okay, thank you, Elizabeth. We're almost out of time. I'm conscious that in 2 weeks' time, the Chancellor will be delivering her spring statement, which was supposed to be a non-event, but it's looking as if it will be increasingly like an event. Everyone on the panel, as a final thought, and just keep it brief, please, a single sentence, in the spirit of Tim and the advice he's given to Chancellors, what one piece of advice would you give Rachel Reeves ahead of her spring statement? Let's go left to right, and let's start with Tim.
I reiterate what I said earlier, to abolish the two-child cap and the benefits cap, and to fund it by whatever means are necessary, including breaking a manifesto promise. The Labour Party is supposed to be a moral purpose, or it is nothing. I see no moral purpose today.
Helen?
Yep, withdraw the plans to cut disability benefits, give the Department for Work and Pensions a chance to do what they are planning to do, which is proper reform, which will help, and commit to lifting the two-child cap and boosting universal credit standard allowance. those are the things that would help most.
Elizabeth?
Local housing allowance, which for temporary accommodation, has been frozen since 2011, despite inflation going up by 44%. I think that would help a lot of London councils, prevent them from going bankrupt over the next year.
We're spending a lot of money up here, but this is good. Max?
Well, this is the way in which we're going to spend the money, is change the fiscal rules so that we don't have to keep fighting with each other about which policies we're going to cut and regain our moral purpose, as Tim said.
Adrian?
Raise the personal tax allowance from 12,570 to 15,000, and do it if you have to over time, but start this coming April. Don't wait until 2028.
There we go. The thoughts of the panel. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.
Terrible idea.